Hello, thanks for watching my video, and please don't forget to hit like, subscribe and comment, and also please consider becoming a patron, details of which you can find in the description below. Edmund Ironside was the third son of King Ethelred II. Born around 990, Edmund may not have expected to become king. For one, his father was having an extremely tough time keeping hold of his throne in the face of Danish invasions, and secondly, he had two older brothers. His oldest brother was called Athelstan, but he died in 1014, and he also had another older brother by the name of Egbert, but not much is known about him. As for their father, the inept Athelred, his reign was a total struggle, and he was deposed by the King of Denmark, Svein Forkbeard, in 1013. Only a few weeks later, in early 1014, Svein died, and Athelred returned from exile in Normandy to reclaim his throne. The English population would have had mixed emotions about seeing Athelred return. However, they may have had some hope in the form of his son, Edmund, who was altogether more resilient than his father and far more warlike, and therefore of a more kingly persuasion than Athelred. After the death of Svein Forkbeard, the Danish cause in England was taken up by his successor, his son Canute, who continued the fierce attacks on England. In 1016, he laid waste to Warwickshire. In response, King Athelred gathered a large army to face off against Canute and his men, but was told he'd be betrayed if he continued any further. And so, in quite typical fashion of Athelred, he withdrew from any battle and disbanded his army. Whether the information is true or not, it does typify the reign of Athelred II. I believe it's most likely the advice was false and came from Athelred's cowardly advisors who did not particularly fancy going into battle against Canute and the Danes. And it's quite likely as well that Athelred was more than willing to listen to this advice. He was not a warrior king in any stretch of the imagination, and he was not a brave man either. And so, putting his own personal safety at priority over the welfare of the country, he disbanded his army. And by withdrawing from that particular battle, he continued to allow his country to go up in flames. Meanwhile, his more proactive son, Edmund, went to the north of England to attack Danish-held territories. Here he was aided by an ealdorman by the name of Uhtred. Canute continued to plunder in the south around areas such as Cambridgeshire, and soon was joined by Uhtred, who decided to leave Edmund's cause and switch sides to Canute. Canute, however, does not seem to have been a man who held such treachery in high regard, and soon had Uhtred executed, and he'd do the same towards the end of 1016 after another man called Edric supposedly had Edmund Ironside murdered. Such was the state of affairs in England in 1016. When Athelred II finally died, 38 years after becoming king, he had left a country in total turmoil, and by this stage it could only be hoped that Edmund Ironside would establish himself on the throne and hopefully, as the English people would have seen it, drive the Vikings out once and for all. Edmund earned his nickname Ironside for his outstanding strength and fierce determination in battle. Here was a man England could put their trust in the face of dark and troubled times. His first move after being declared king was to go to Wessex, where he received homage from his nobles. His succession seemed to galvanise the population. In London, repeated Danish attacks were repelled by the citizens there, and in the south-west, Edmund and his men gained a tremendous victory at Penselwood in Somerset. A second battle between Edmund and Canute was fought at Shurston in Wiltshire. The outcome here was not as clear as Penselwood, and both sides sustained heavy losses. But after the battle, the two sides went their separate ways, and Edmund then marched on London, which was still coming under tremendous pressure from Danish attacks. Here he managed to drive the Danish attackers out and force them to retreat to their ships and flee. Shortly after, at Brentford, Edmund took to battle again, and, despite suffering needless losses after a number of his men drowned in a river that they had tried to cross too quickly, he once again won the battlefield. By this point, Edmund's men and the English population at large must have surely felt they finally had a king worthy of the throne after decades of misery. But in October of 1016, Edmund and his men met the Danes at the Battle of Ashendon, which ended in disaster as the English suffered many heavy losses. And it was largely due to an unscrupulous and thoroughly unlikable man by the name of Edric, whom I mentioned earlier. Edric was a man who had switched sides on several occasions, and in fact, just prior to Ashendon, having supposedly come back to Edmund's forces, Edric managed to put a halt to Edmund's pursuit of a fleeing Danish army in Kent. Edmund's men had all the momentum and were in fact on the brink of inflicting a potentially fatal blow on Danish forces in England, when for some reason Edmund heeded Edric's advice to hold back. And once more, at Ashendon, Edric would wreak havoc. Edmund's forces started the battle well, and looked to be winning the day until Edric, seeing that the English were on top, spread a rumour that the king was in fact dead. The English went into a panic, and the Danes, for the first time against Edmund, really took full advantage. After the battle, a treaty was signed, completely in Canute's favour, with Edmund only receiving Wessex, whilst Canute ruled over the rest of England. 6 weeks after the disaster at Ashendon, King Edmund Ironside was dead. A famous and gruesome story goes that he was murdered whilst going to the toilet, with a dagger or sword stabbing him from beneath. Unsurprisingly, the culprit accused of the murder is Edric. It's not certain that the story is true, but it's certainly possible, and Edmund's death would have very much suited Canute, who was now sole king of England. Canute knew full well that even though the treaty that had been signed after the Battle of Ashendon had severely reduced Edmund's power, he would have continued to be a serious thorn in his side, and so his enemy's death suited the Dane right down to a T. Canute would have also been quite relieved at the death of Edric, whom he must have been growing quite sick of. So much so, he had Edric, who had done him numerous favours, executed. It's hard to feel sorry for Edric, who very much got what he deserved. The story of Edmund Ironside is a short one, and very much a story of what-ifs. If he had lived longer, he could have been one of the great kings in English history, and he certainly had the Vikings, for a time at least in 1016, on the back foot. Ashenden, sadly, ended all English hope of a glorious and long reign of King Edmund Ironside. He still remains, however, one of the fine Saxon kings.